Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I'm Kayla, and I make videos around period dramas, history, and historical fiction, and I am nervous. When you think of period dramas, what is the first thing you think of in terms of who makes them? If you'd say the BBC, then like me, you probably grew up watching miniseries such as Pride and Prejudice, North and South, Jane Eyre, Howard's End, and Cranford. I knew a lot of these through watching them on Masterpiece Theatre in the US on PBS, but it's the BBC in the UK who have made these shows and films for years. They've cultivated a reputation for kind of helping develop a blueprint for well-made, made-for-television period dramas that hold their popularity generation after generation. A lot of people in the UK and then obviously outside of the UK don't know what's going on with the BBC right now and how that is potentially affecting all of its shows, but especially shows that would be on the higher end of the budget. So even though there are more smaller budget period dramas, anytime you're trying to make a setting in the past, historical costuming, researching, filming at historical locations, or building sets that resemble historical sites, stuff gets costly really quick. So BBC made period dramas are in danger right now, and I'm going to talk about why in this video. The rise of streaming, soaring budgets, and shrinking public service funding have created a perfect storm for the potential end of the BBC period drama and other shows, obviously. Like, could you imagine there being like a new hit like Sherlock never getting made? These faces to never grace our screens, like, I can't bear the thought. It's no secret that British television sells worldwide. According to an article in The Guardian in 2024, Netflix spent almost £3 billion on British-made content. British filmmaking, storytelling, acting, it sells, especially in other English-speaking countries like the US and Australia. In the past, a lot of British-made content was exported to other countries through public broadcasting. I remember as a teenager buying as many Masterpiece Theatre DVDs that I could get my hands on because it was hard to always catch British miniseries and TV shows because they were niche at the time. They weren't on any of the major networks, but certainly in the last 20 years that has drastically changed. With the high proportion of British talent that become successful in the US, whether that be major actors, bands, singers, sports stars, it was also impressive how many of these shows made on smaller budgets with less accessibility to huge filming lots and an integrated entertainment industry over in Hollywood that were able to compete in the award arena alongside so many hits in the US. Period dramas like Peaky Blinders and Call the Midwife, made by the BBC, have received various nominations over the years, including the original Wolf Hall with Mark Rylance receiving a Golden Globe in 2015 for his performance of Thomas Cromwell. But how that worked was built on a delicate balance. Public service broadcasters with license fee funding and modest co-production partnerships with US streamers. When that balance started to tip, cracks appeared. The BBC is cutting $150 million from its content spend this year, blaming an unprecedented content funding challenge as streamers refuse to share risk on co-productions. As streaming giants compete to make the next global hit, they've driven up the cost of filming in the UK. Everything from crew rates to studio spaces have skyrocketed. According to the producers group PACT, 15 big British dramas that were ready to go have now been put on hold because broadcasters just can't afford to make them anymore. Why is this? In the UK, a lot of TV shows are made by something called public service broadcasters, or PSBs, like the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and Channel 5. These broadcasters make programs that are meant to inform, educate, and entertain everyone. They say not just make money, but lately they've had less money to work with, which means they can't make as many shows or pay for big productions like they used to. I wrote the bulk of the script before the PBS news, so I'll be honest with you, I don't even know how PBS in the US getting defunded will also affect some of these joint Masterpiece Theater BBC BritBox shows. I don't know how much of PBS funding in the US goes into some of these shows, so I don't want to comment on that because I can't find a definitive answer on how much PBS contributes to specifically like Masterpiece Theater programs. But clearly, public sponsored broadcasting is under threat slash struggling globally, and I'm not happy about it. There are a few big reasons why this is happening. First, fewer people are watching traditional TV. Less than half of young people are watching linear programs, so i.e. live television. And most people are using streaming services like Netflix and Disney instead. So that means PSBs are losing viewers, and with fewer people watching live, they're also losing advertising money for channels like ITV and Channel 4. Another issue is inflation. The cost of everything, from equipment to staff to locations, has gone up, but budgets haven't kept up. So it now costs more to make a TV show than it did just a few years ago. And because the PSBs don't have enough money to cover those rising costs, they have to make cuts. That means fewer jobs for writers, camera people, actors, and all the behind the scenes crew. Now, some people might wonder why they still see a lot of TV being made in the UK, especially shows on Netflix or Amazon. The truth is, those shows are often filmed here but are paid for by big American companies. That means that the money and decisions come from outside the UK. These shows don't always hire the same people who worked on PSB shows, and they're often focused on what global audiences want, not just British ones. Another article in The Guardian, they've been covering this a lot more than other sources. In an article in April 2025, they talked about this outsourcing and the impact it's having in the UK, saying freelancers form 70% of the UK's TV workforce. And without work, many are now retraining, stacking shelves, or leaving the industry altogether. So while the UK might still look busy on screen, a lot of local talent is being left behind. One of the biggest issues that British television is facing is the pressure to Americanize their content, especially if the funding is coming from American sources. As UK broadcasters face budget constraints, American streaming giants are stepping in to fund more productions, but often with strings attached. So how this works is that streamers want to own the entire intellectual property of a show, which is different than how public service broadcasters do it, which is where they can sell the rights abroad, get some royalties from worldwide releases, which changes the funding model. Streamers now refuse to co-fund alongside PSBs, so they own all of it. I have heard, unconfirmed, but through the grapevine, allegedly, as, as you've got to say on YouTube, that to make these shows more digestible to US audiences, creative teams are frequently encouraged to simplify scripts or adjust pacing. So HBO's Industry, for example, the creators were asked to add extra context to scenes involving British media or politics, and to have actors speak more slowly just in case American viewers couldn't keep up. This tailoring of tone and tempo may seem small, but it changes the rhythm of storytelling in subtle, cumulative ways. Then there's the issue of visual authenticity. One of the craziest shows to me in terms of setting is Netflix's Sex Education, which heavily leans into an American aesthetic. As an American who's lived in the UK for over a decade, there is a bit of cultural blending when it comes to television, music, or foods, like Reese's or Pop-Tarts becoming more mainstream in the UK over the years. But shows like this create an alternate UK reality visually that just does not exist, and it is much more tailored to an American aesthetic. The show's British students wear varsity jackets, play American football, and roam around a school that looks way more like a high school in the Midwest than anywhere in the UK. The houses do exist in the UK, but they're not typical houses. They're like multi-million pound houses that average families would never live in. In an article by The Guardian, again, the writer Grant McCracken says that these choices weren't incidental. They were made to appeal to a US market that expects certain visual cues of teenage life, even if they don't match the reality of British education. And look, globalization is a thing. So through TV and social media, there are more cultural things that are going to cross-pollinate over the years that would not have happened as much before the internet. So some of this stuff in shows is understandable, but some of it is it's over the top. It feels really over the top. And look, shows aren't always meant to be authentic to real culture. I'm just meaning that, like, maybe the humor or the daily struggles of the characters or the setting would be more recognizable to Brits first and then the rest of the world second, rather than appealing to an outside audience first. This trend is especially noticeable in period dramas, which have always played a bit with like fantasy, but are increasingly being shaped by American audiences and tastes. Bridgerton, which I've repeatedly said is not a straight up period drama, and I've got no needs for it to be historically accurate. It's really fun just the way it is. However, there is definitely a more like steamy, soapy, American-esque vibe to the world of Bridgerton that would probably be made very differently if it were predominantly a British crew writing, directing, and producing the show. All the lush sets and the string quartet pop covers and Gossip Girl style drama, I love it. It's such fun escapism, and I'm not saying it should become some sort of like BBC Pride and Prejudice period drama. I'm just making the point that it has 100% been made for an American audience first and foremost, and then the rest of the world behind that. I loved Sanditon, which was an adaptation of Jane Austen's unfinished novel that she was working on before she died. Like everyone else, I was really excited that after the show got canceled in the UK, that it had a second life and got the funding for season 2 and 3 by PBS's Masterpiece Theater in May 2021. And maybe because a large amount of that funding came from the US, it should be allowed to be a bit more Americanized. But all I'm pointing out is that there's definitely more of a lighter, more colorful, soapy tone to season 2 and 3 that you could really identify that wasn't there in the first season, in my opinion. This Americanization, it doesn't even have to mean more Americanized. It can also mean amplifying stereotypical British quirks that Americans find entertaining that Brits would see as an oversimplification or wouldn't interact with on a daily basis, or like just casting one specific Southern accent for the entire cast, which isn't representative of all of the UK. I think a good example of amplifying stereotypical British quirks for an American audience would be some of the visual differences between the UK and US traders. They're filmed at the same place, a country house in Scotland, while the UK version does use the castle as a foreboding setting for the show, with sometimes daunting lighting and highlighting the dark architecture. There's more of a spectacle in the US version that everyone's in Scotland, bagpipes, accentuated tartan, ginger-haired gamekeepers is definitely more like exaggerated to feel Scottish. What results in these types of UK-based shows for a US audience can become a hybrid product, not quite British, not quite American, but carefully crafted for international streaming appeal. While that approach can widen audiences, it can dilute the authenticity and nuance that originally defined a lot of these shows and make some audiences feel like there's something missing or not quite right. I certainly can tell pretty immediately when a show is set in the UK, but it's meant to be tailored to an American audience because it feels like a really picturesque, like over the top version of the UK. It's very like pip pip cheerio, which I've like never heard anyone say over here ever. What this does mean is that some shows that would be primarily for a UK audience are at threat of just not being made, like BBC period dramas. Some of these recent shows with smaller budgets that have almost not been made have had a lot of potential to make an impact. And it's scary to think if audiences hadn't seen them. So I am worried about some of these smaller shows. For instance, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office was nearly passed over multiple times before finally getting made. The series told the true story of hundreds of innocent sub-postmasters who were wrongly accused of theft due to a faulty computer system, something that happened over decades but hadn't fully entered the public consciousness. The drama gripped the nation, sparked outrage, and led to a renewed public and political response, including emergency legislation being introduced in Parliament to help clear the names of those affected. It was a powerful reminder of how scripted drama can illuminate real injustices. Mr. Bates versus the Post Office proves that even a modestly budgeted drama, if given the chance, can shake the system and have real world consequences. One of the best period dramas I've seen in recent years is Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, which came out in the UK late 2024. And I've included it in my video on the best and worst period dramas of 2024, and then it came out in the US in May 2025. The director of Wolf Hall has been really vocal in the media in the past several months about his concern about BBC period dramas and how hard it was to find any sort of streaming support for Wolf Hall because it's been kind of deemed as a niche period drama with less global appeal, and all of the major streaming platforms turned it down, which feels really wild to me because of just how fantastic of a show it is, and it ticks so many boxes of like the blueprint for a successful period drama that will one day become a classic. The Mirror and the Light is the final chapter in the Wolf Hall story, and it follows Thomas Cromwell, a man from humble beginnings who rose to be chief advisor to the king, and how he clings to power in the brutal court of Henry VIII. It's not your typical flashy Tudor period drama. It's slow, it's sharp, it's emotionally intense with complex characters and moral gray zones. Cromwell isn't a clear hero or a villain, and that's what makes it so compelling. It's a solid period drama without a ton of bells and whistles that really packs a punch. So I was shocked when I saw news about the fact that something like Wolf Hall potentially wouldn't see the light of day, or the fact that might be that going forward, the BBC can't afford to make this kind of content anymore. Can I go on like a really quick mini rant about Mark Rylance as Thomas Cromwell? He is so good in this performance. I have never watched anyone play such a morally ambiguous character on screen. Like, I cannot get in his character's head, but at the same time, I empathize with him because he is not a good character or a bad character, because we think of ourselves as good people sometimes and bad people sometimes, and we make selfish decisions and we change our minds, which have effect on other people. And like, he's just so good in this, and he's like a zaddy and walking around in the long cloaks. And okay, let's get back to the topic at hand. Peter Kaminsky went before Parliament in 2024 to speak out about the state of UK television and the importance of public service broadcasting, saying, 10 years ago, I made Wolf Hall, the BBC TV adaptation of Hilary Mantel's two Booker Prize winning novels. Last year, I directed The Mirror and the Light, completing the adaptation of Hilary's trilogy. I'm writing this submission to alert the committee to the fact that, were we to try and make The Mirror and the Light today, we would not succeed. Despite the global success of Wolf Hall, not one of the major international streamers showed any interest in co-financing the final installment. Mark Rylance, myself, and others worked for a fraction of our normal salaries, and even then the BBC had to make substantial cuts to the production, cutting expensive exteriors and more. Without the actors and the director all agreeing to cut their salaries significantly, and the BBC cutting in several places, the show never would have been made. Kaminsky made the argument that not every single show has to appeal to an American audience, that it is important to make shows that can impact British audiences, and then if it happens to appeal to a wider audience, then great. Mr. Bates is a great example of this. That actually had like real world impact on the case of the postmasters and put pressure on the government to act. Drama has that kind of power to impact audiences. I don't think that if that show had been made for an American audience, it would have resonated in the same way with a UK one. I am not highlighting this to say like British made television for British people only, to be focused on like our upper class, grand house, colonial history type thing that needs to be preserved. There are so many lessons, personal, political, and historical, that period dramas funded by British public service broadcasters like the BBC and ITV have delivered to audiences over the years. They've helped me and so many others, I'm sure, understand the world beyond textbook history. Through thoughtful storytelling, they've shown the individual human cost of colonization and the British Empire, not just from a British perspective, but through the lives of those affected in places like Jamaica, India, and Ireland. These dramas have also shown some of the unspoken rules of society, how class shaped people's lives, how wealth protected some and doomed others, and how women's experiences were often constrained by invisible cages of expectation. Whether it's Small Island exploring post-war immigration, the Long Song confronting the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean, or Downton Abbey touching on shifting social hierarchies. These shows reflect history not as a grand narrative, but as something that's felt in everyday love, loss, and survival for people. Are they all historically accurate? No, no period drama is, quite frankly. But what makes these series so powerful is their ability to balance the personal with the political in a nuanced way. Friendship, romance, grief, betrayal. These dramas don't just show us history, they make us feel the weight and long-term impact on generations. That's why I worry about the future of these kinds of shows. There's a growing pressure to package the UK's past as charming, glamorous, and export friendly, especially when it comes to prioritizing stories of upper class society. But British history isn't just tea sets and ballrooms. It's empire, it's inequality, it's migration, it's resistance. Period dramas have long been one of the few mainstream ways audiences engage with the legacy of the British Empire. When those stories are filtered through the lens of what's palatable to a global market, we risk flattening difficult truths in favor of marketable nostalgia. There's a danger that the predominant stories are only the parts of history that feel comfortable or familiar or commercially safe. So, editing Kayla here, I've just been looking through the footage and I wanted to make sure that I cleared up one specific point. I want to acknowledge that there are absolutely valid criticisms of public service broadcasters like the BBC and ITV, like whether that's to do with how they've handled presenters in the past, staff pay, internal culture, or like issues around impartiality in news reporting. Many people also feel frustrated with the programming choices being made, and those concerns deserve to be heard and acted on. I'm not ignoring any of that. I also know that, streaming services like Netflix have been able to make some really powerful, regionally specific stories like adolescence. And there are definitely times when PSBs have missed the mark in terms of like diverse casting or romanticizing parts of history. But I do worry going forward, some smaller but important stories like Three Little Birds about three women from the Windrush generation might not have been greenlit by a big global streamer, even though it's exactly the kind of story that deserves to be told nationally, if nothing else. I just want to point out that shows like Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which had a real impact, might have never been made without a public service broadcaster willing to take that risk. It's a bit worrying to think about a future where only huge global media companies are deciding what stories get to be told, mostly based on what's going to make the most money. That said, maybe platforms like YouTube could become a space for more local, meaningful stories to be made on smaller budgets where the public can actually have more of a say in what gets made. So who knows? It's all up in the air right now. But I didn't want anyone to think that I thought that like PSBs are perfect or that there's not things that they need to work on or change, because they definitely do. And to lighten the mood here just slightly after my rant, let's be honest. These types of period dramas have brought us historical butts. You know what I'm talking about. Andrew Davies started it when Colin Firth emerged from the lake at Pemberley, and then for whatever reason, it just became a thing that if it's a period drama and a romance, you're gonna get some butts. They're gonna gift us with some guy like Poldark emerging from the sea or a lake after a really restrained scene. And do you really want that to end? No, you don't. This dumb channel. So what's the solution? How do we keep our bare-butted lakemen? Just kidding. I want to preface this by saying that I am not in this industry, so I am not going to be suggesting solutions myself. But what Peter Kaminsky and other leading voices in the industry are proposing is to introduce a 5% levy on the UK revenues of streaming platforms like Disney, Netflix, and Amazon Prime. This isn't a radical idea. It's already in place in 17 European countries, including France and Germany, where streamers are required to reinvest a small portion of their profits into local content. Their thinking is if these platforms are making money from British viewers and using UK crews, sets, and talent, they should contribute to the creative ecosystem that they are benefiting from. This levy would create a dedicated fund to support high-end British dramas that are culturally important, but maybe financially out of reach for struggling public broadcasters. It could help safeguard the kinds of shows that PSBs used to fund. Kaminsky argues that without this kind of structural support, these stories won't get told because they're too specific, too challenging, or just not global enough to attract streamer investment. Aside from the streaming levy, there's also a big push for more co-productions, like when Netflix and the BBC teamed up to co-fund The Crown in its early seasons. It helped spread the cost and meant the show could be made at the scale that it deserved. There's also talk about updating tax breaks to make it easier and more appealing to film in the UK. All of this is about keeping the UK's creative scene alive and well, not just the big glossy shows, but the diverse, complex stories that reflect British life. Because once the funding disappears, it's really hard to rebuild, and it's audiences who will lose out in the end. I know for plenty of international audiences, other Americans who have loved British television from the time they were little, they would also want for these shows to be made by British crews and writers. So what can we do as an audience to help? We can also obviously watch the shows, talk about them online, get traction going for PSBs to continue making these shows. Globally, it helps to watch and share these dramas, especially the ones that might not have a massive marketing budget. We've all seen what happened with Sanditon. There is power in numbers. Word of mouth still matters, especially online. The more people tune in, the more likely these shows are to be funded. If something happens to like BBC, ITV period dramas in our current global climate, I am simply going to combust, okay? I can't afford a house. I can't even afford avocado toast right now that they say that the millennials are just eating up. These period dramas have been my constant companion these 20 years, and I will lose my mind if they stop making them. So we cannot have that happening, okay? We can't have it happening. What is your favorite BBC period drama? Comment below. I'm still up for suggestions after all these years. I love too many to name just one or two, but I am totally up for suggestions. I'd love to know about some I've never seen. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying this kind of content. I hope this video was useful. I know it's a bit niche, but I feel like people need to know what's going on. Thanks for watching. Let's go watch Pride and Prejudice for the 1000th time and cry into a cup of tea. At this point, it's my therapy, because I can't afford that either. Okay, bye.